Hello everyone and welcome to our Education Connections webinar featuring Dr. Jose L. Medina from the Center for Applied Linguistics. Our webinar topic today is titled ¿Qué content and language objectives son importantes? We want to extend a warm welcome to everyone who's been able to join us for our second live event of the 2015-2016 school year. We're happy to see the familiar names of some of our Education Connection members as well as some new participants as well. We're so glad you could all join us. Thanks for taking the time to be with us on this beautiful evening. We'll begin today's session with a brief introduction, including an overview of Education Connections. Next, we'll hear from Dr. Medina. Following and throughout the presentation, we'll have some time reserved for questions and comments from participants. We'll be monitoring questions as they come in, and we encourage you to send along any thoughts or questions that come to mind during the presentation using the question box in the GoToWebinar window. During today's session, we'll also be posting some polling questions related to both your background and today's topic. Once results are in, we'll post them for you to view. At the end of the Q&A, we'll briefly wrap up and remind you of the ways to continue the conversation we start tonight. We'll be doing some interactive activities during the webinar, but we also invite you to chat further about tonight's topic by joining us on Twitter. You can use the hashtag EdConnect, EDCONX, to participate in the conversation with Education Connection staff as well as your fellow educators. For those of you who may be new to Education Connections, we wanted to briefly introduce you to the community and resources that are available. Education Connections is an initiative of the Center for Applied Linguistics in collaboration with the University of Oregon. It is hosted on the University of Oregon's Oberverse platform. Education Connections is a free online community providing access to a wide range of resources and bringing educators together to collaborate around and implementing high-quality standards-based instruction with all students, especially English learner students. There are many different ways to participate in today's webinar as well as on the Education Connections platform. You can share ideas and ask questions in the discussion forums. You can find resources to use in your classroom. You can participate in live events such as this one and read Tuesday's tips and Friday's fun facts that are shared in the forums every week. Anyone is welcome to join, so we invite you to sign up today if you're already not a member. You can see the link on the slide below. As a reminder, the Education Connections team will post a video archive of the webinar, a PDF of the PowerPoint, and links to resources related to today's webinar. To access these resources, log on to Education Connections and click on the Webinars or Live Events tab. On your screen, you'll see a few polling questions regarding your background. We'll post these results as they come in. Let's get started. So in the first polling question, it asks, what grade levels do you primarily teach? Oh, it looks like we have 56% of elementary school teachers with us tonight, 4% of middle school teachers, 9% of tonight's participants teach in the high schools, 11% teach in post-secondary settings, and 20% are still finishing the poll. In our second question tonight, we're interested to know, what is your current position? Are you a content general education teacher? Do you teach ELL or ESOL? Are you a bilingual teacher, an administrator, or does your position not fit into one of these categories? Okay, wow. Looks like 8% of tonight's audience are content and general education teachers. 29% are ELL or ESOL teachers. 17% of you are bilingual teachers. 21 have administrative type roles. And 25% of you teach in a specific category, have a different job title that doesn't fit into one of these categories. And our third and final question, we'd like to know, what kind of support do you provide to ELLs in your class and in your school and institution? Okay. Wow. Looks like more than half of you are bilingual or dual language programming, and you offer those services to your ELLs, whereas 22% of you offer sheltered instruction support, 24 offer self-contained English as a second language, 41 are involved in the push-in, pull-out ESL support, and 15% offer native language supports to your English language learners. Well, great. Well, that concludes the polling, and at this point, I'm very excited to turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Jose Medina.
Hello, everybody. ¿Cómo están? Buenas tardes. Saludos desde Washington, D.C. I'm so excited that you've joined us for today's session. ¿Qué? Content and language objectives son importantes. I'm so very excited that you joined us because I love the diversity in all of the participants that are here with us today. So let's go ahead and get you to the right slide so that we can get started. Before we begin, one of the things that I always like to do is to ask participants, why is it that we're here? Because so often we know what we do and how we do it, but we don't have the why of what it is that we actually provide services to our students for. So you'll notice that I use a lot of Spanish. It's because I value my native language, which is Spanish, of course. So if you'll take a moment to read the following slide, it's by one of my academic crushes, Paulo Freire. La educación no cambia el mundo. Cambia a las personas que van a cambiar el mundo. In English, this translates to education isn't going to change the world. It changes the people, in our case, the students that will change the world. And so I hope that by taking a look at this slide and this quotation that you'll be able to go ahead and establish a foundation for the conversations that we're going to engage in today. So I do want to share my full name. Mi nombre es el Dr. José Luis Medina Hernández Franco López, Jr. de Diaz Cruz. I know it is an extremely long name. My mom was very, very proud where I came from and where she came from, and so she taught me all of my different last names. One of the things that I think is so important for English learners in our classroom. And I did post a picture there of myself as I actually entered the public school system. I already mentioned that I am an English learner. My parents are from Ciudad Juárez, Chihuahua in Mexico, and I was born in El Paso, Texas. My entry into the school system was actually pretty traumatic. It was a submersion model where I was actually was punished if I used my native language. And so it's one of the things that I like to remind participants whenever I'm facilitating PD, because I think that when I was a teacher and an administrator, I wanted to know, who is this person in front of me that's sharing information with me? And so I definitely wanted you to know that. My mom and my dad only have a limited formal education. My mom completed the 6th grade in Ciudad Juárez, and my dad only completed the 5th grade in Ciudad Juárez. But nonetheless, they were awesome parents and really created access for my 2 siblings and I so that we could really take advantage of the opportunities that were not made available to them. I know that you want to know a little bit about my background, and so I'll share a little bit about myself as well. I was a high school teacher as well as a middle school teacher, but I've also served at the elementary school level, so I'm one of those strange educators that actually loves all grade levels. The first half of my career was spent at the middle school and high school level, and the second part of my career at the elementary school level. I was an assistant principal after I left the classroom, then became a principal, specifically a dual language campus principal. So I'm excited that we have so many dual language and bilingual teachers here today. Van a ver, les va a encantar esta sesión. So let's go ahead and get started with the rest of the session. I always like to establish norms because I think that even in a webinar, participants need to be aware of what the expectations are. So if I were with you and we were in the same room, I know that I could use my proximity to you so that I could go ahead and be able to get you to participate. But since I don't have that here, let's just remember that we're going to be respectful of all participants. All of us have a good heart and are here to serve students, and so we need to go ahead and be respectful of each other's thoughts and opinions. We're going to have positive intent. I hope that that's something that you'll be able to go along with me on this, because obviously there are many obstacles in education, but it's our job to really be positive as we try to serve our English learners' needs. And then finally, I want you to actively participate in the webinar activities. One of the things that my team and I have done is to really create opportunities for you to interact with me so that we can go ahead and help each other as we try to serve effectively the needs of all of our English learners. But let's go ahead and warm up. So for those of, I see that some of the names actually I recognize. So for those of you that know me out there, you know that I like to go ahead and push the boundaries just a little bit, because I think that when we are uncomfortable at times, it's when the greatest learning takes place. So you will see an opportunity to actually, in your question box, to go ahead and answer some of the following questions. First and foremost, in your opinion, what is the difference between a content objective and a language objective? So please go ahead and enter that into your chat box, into your question box, excuse me. What is the difference between a content objective and a language objective? I'll give you just a moment for that. No tengan vergüenza. Make sure that you are not embarrassed. We are in a safe space, and so if you don't know, go ahead and put that you don't know. I think that this session is really going to help us really come to a better understanding of what a content and a language objective is, what they each are. I see some of you typing in Spanish. Me gusta muchísimo, porque los dos idiomas son iguales tienen igual de valor, ¿verdad? Okay, perfect. So I see that a lot of you really grasp the concept that the content objective is the what the students are going to be learning. And most of you are on the right track as far as the language objective. It's the how they are going to demonstrate that they've acquired or accessed the content knowledge via listening, speaking, reading, and writing activities. Some of you talk a little bit about the 4 language domains, which I love. We're going to be talking about those as well. Perfect. Okay, so here comes your second question. So why are language objectives so important as we strive to meet English learners' needs? So as Jose and myself, when I entered the school system, why would it have been helpful for my teachers to use language objectives as they were trying to meet my needs? And go ahead and once again type in the question box so that I can take a look at some of your answers. Remember that if I were with you, I would totally be standing right next to you so that you could be participating. So type away. Ándale, ándale. Me encanta, para ver las habilidades comunicativas so that we can see the student's ability as far as communication is concerned, para que se puedan expresar, para mejorar la comunicación, to improve communication. Se tienen que saber expresar. They definitely need to be able to express themselves. And of course, the language domains are very, very important, which some of you are talking about. El poder comunicarse oralmente, be able to speak orally, la lectura, which is the reading, writing, la escritura, and then of course, listening, escuchar también es bastante importante. Las 4 son muy importantes. The 4 language domains are very important. Thank you so much. So we're going to go ahead and move forward. This gives me a good idea of where we are as a participant group, as a participant cohort, and so I hope that by the end of today's session, some of those questions will be clarified, and for those of you that are already using the content and language objectives, you'll have even a more deep understanding. Así es que aquí están nuestros objetivos de la videoconferencia web. These are objectives for our webinar today. Again, if you were with me, I would have one of you read them, but since you're not, I'll read them myself. Here we go. Content objective. The webinar participants will be able to identify key characteristics of effective content and language objectives. And so obviously this is the what of what we're going to be discussing today. The language objective for our webinar participants will be able to, via interactive poll activities, modify a written content and language objective. And so that is the how you're going to be able to access the content objective for today's webinar. Via a written task, you're going to show me that you're able to modify a written content and language objective. Así es que prepárense, get ready. So let's start off just by reminding ourselves, ¿qué es sheltered instruction? Because I have to tell you that one of the things that I get to do here at the Center for Applied Linguistics is travel all over the country and provide support to school districts in states across the country. And most people have varied definitions of what sheltered instruction is. So I wanted to share really so that it forever will stick in your mind what it means when we talk about sheltered instruction. Sheltered instruction is making grade-level academic content accessible to English learners via listening, speaking, reading, and writing activities. There was a time when students like myself were not given access to grade-level content because teachers felt that if I didn't have enough English to be able to understand the academic content, that I needed to be kept away from that academic content. And so what we know now, obviously, is that students have to have access to that academic content from the moment that they enter your classroom, whether they have any English at all. And so it is our job as teachers to make that academic content accessible via those listening, speaking, reading, and writing activities. The education connections, 4 strands of sheltered instruction, I really, really love the way that they simplify, I think, for all of us, the way in which we can truly shelter instruction, which is to define, modify, cultivate, and apply, so that all of us can really create meaningful activities for our students that are allowing us to reach them at wherever it is that they come into our classrooms, at whatever levels they are when they come into our classrooms. And so today's webinar will not focus on all 4, but we definitely are going to focus on define, because that's where the content and language objectives reside. So let's take a look at define. Develop, define, refine, communicate, and assess content objectives for every lesson. I love that we are reminded that we're to communicate the content objectives. That's specifically communication with our students, of course. Develop, define, refine, communicate, and assess language objectives for every lesson, not just once in a while, but every single lesson. Tenemos que recordar que nuestros estudiantes tienen que tener la oportunidad de manejar esos objetivos del contenido, pero también del idioma. And then the third one, of course, ensure that our objectives derive from and are aligned with English language proficiency levels, as well as our content standards. One of the things that most teachers tell me as I visit different campuses and school districts around the country is that the content objectives and the language objectives are there so that if an administrator comes into your classroom, they know what it is that you're working on. And so what I will tell you throughout the session is that actually the content objectives and the language objectives are truly for our students. If I walk into your classroom, I want to be able to ask one of your students, ¿qué es el objetivo del contenido en el cual estás trabajando? What is the content objective that you're working on today? Or I could ask one of your other students, which one of the 4 language domains are you working on as far as your language objective is concerned? And the students should be able to explain to me, well, today I'm practicing on listening, or I'm working on reading and writing. So that's something that we're going to go ahead and stress throughout the webinar today. Before we get ahead of ourselves, one of the things that I like to remind teachers is that we have to keep it real. We have to be honest with ourselves and with our practice, and it is only when we're honest with ourselves that we can truly begin to create access for all of our students. And so I'm going to ask you some very, very honest questions about your practice at this time. And if you could please go ahead and answer in the question box. I want you to think, What is the difference between an additive bilingualism ideology and a subtractive bilingualism ideology? What is the difference between an additive bilingualism ideology and a subtractive bilingualism ideology? I see that some of you don't know, which is perfect. Thank you for being honest. I'm glad that you feel comfortable. I see some other people are putting no sé. Some of you are taking the route of explaining to us that you value your students' cultural background, which is perfect. Thank you for that. Valuing the first language, adding the second language without getting rid of the first language is what some of you are writing. Perfect. Additive fosters true bilingualisms is what one of you wrote. Okay, so we're going to answer that question for you all in just a moment. The next question, I'm actually not going to ask you to enter into the chat box, but I want you to just think about it because I think that it will be important for you as you continue to reflect on your practice. So, now that we've tried to figure out what the difference between an additive bilingualism ideology and a subtractive bilingualism ideology is, which of the two ideologies drives the support that you provide to the English learners in your classroom, campus, or district? And again, if you didn't know what the difference was, no worries. How is it that you try to support your English learners in your classroom, campus, or district? So here we go. Here's our definition for those of you that didn't know, for those of you that had an idea and were on the right path. Additive bilingualism really fosters the first language as it continues to be developed, and the first culture is valued even as the second language is added. In subtractive bilingualism, the second language is added at the expense of the first language and culture. So I'm going to give you a moment to just go ahead and continue to look at those definitions and also recall the questions that I posed in the prior slide. Which of these two do you actually use to drive the support that you offer your English learners in your classroom? So let's talk a little bit about it because one of the things that most people don't realize, or even as we write our content and language objectives so that the administrator on campus can see that we're actually posting them, is that there's an actual fundamental reason why content and language objectives are important that are aligned to an additive bilingualism ideology. The reason that content and language objectives are so important is that they create access for every single English learner in your classroom. The thing is that if you were to ask most of us as educators, how is it that we provide support to our students, the truth is that many of us have said statements like, well, I need to quickly transition my student to English so that he or she can be successful. And I would say to you, ay Dios mío, you need to stop and think, because perhaps what you didn't realize is that as we say things like that, we're actually being subtractive in nature. English learners do not need to be transitioned to anything. Our job as educators and advocates for every single English learner is to go ahead and add an additional language while still valuing the first language and the culture and experience that the student brings into our classroom. But I have to keep it real with you and tell you that often I meet teachers that still continue to feel that our job as educators and those of us that support the needs of English learners, it truly is to help students transition to English. And so every time that you start to think that way, or that you hear those kinds of phrases come out of your mouth, you need to really stop and be reflective about the fact that that is not our job. Our job is to value the student, his or her language, and just help them acquire a second language. One of the things that I love to do when I'm facilitating content and language objective PD in person is to actually go ahead and talk about an additive versus subtractive ideology continuum. At the very subtractive level, we have a submersion kind of program model. That is the type of program model that I had to survive as a child. But next on the continuum would actually be an ESL pull-out model, where the students may be receiving instruction that is or is not aligned to what is happening in the classroom. Next along the continuum would be a push-in ESL model. After that, an early exit bilingual program where we would support the students' native language just for a couple of years and then try to once again transition them to English, followed by a late exit transitional model, bilingual model, where we would support the students maybe up to 5th grade in their native language, and then finally dual language programming, which is the most additive of all the program models. What I do want to remind you though is that if you're an ESL teacher that is pushing in or pulling out, then that means that you really need to be overt about the fact that you are additive in nature as you are providing support to the students, and letting the students know that you are going to provide them with content and language objectives that will allow them to access the grade level curriculum as they also acquire the English language via speaking, listening, reading, and writing activities. I know that you may have some questions about additive and subtractive bilingualism, and so just know that even after this webinar is over, you have a new friend, and it's me. Again, you have Jose Luis Medina Hernandez, Franco Lopez Jr. de Cruz, ready to answer your questions via email. So again, here are 4 language domains, and the fact that content and language objectives do create educational access and opportunity for our English learners. When writing content and language objectives, cuando están escribiendo y planeando las lecciones y van a ver qué es el contenido que van a enseñar y cuál va a ser el idioma que los estudiantes van a necesitar para poder alcanzar esas metas, here are some of the things that you need to do, and that you need to remember. Objectives should be shared with students. They should be measurable, observable, and action-oriented, standards-based, of course. Appropriate for the students. Remember that students are the most important piece of this puzzle, and they're the ones that the objectives are serving, and of course supported by class activities. Content objectives, as most of us know, are usually drawn from state standards. You would actually use the verbs in the state standards to create your content objectives. There are some examples on the screen, and I do want to read over 2 quick examples. Students will be able to identify specific landforms on a map of North America, and so identify is that key word that would have been drawn from the state standard. Students will be able to compare and contrast animal and plant cells. So once again, the content objective is something that I feel most of us are comfortable with in comparison to language objectives. A language objective, again, addresses the language needed to achieve the content objective. They are verbs related to listening, speaking, reading, and writing. Some examples. Students will be able to orally describe the function of a nucleus to a partner. Los estudiantes van a poder describir oralmente la función de un núcleo a un compañero. Students will be able to write out the functions of the parts of both animal and plant cells. So obviously in the first one we see that the one domain that we're focusing on is speaking, and in the second one it would be writing. But how are they connected? So here's one example where we actually will take the content objective and language objective, and they're interrelated. So students will be able to explain how a bill becomes law, and in order to access that academic content, students will be able to list parts of a step-by-step process in the correct order of how a bill becomes a law. So you see that the language objective really is supporting the students to achieve that content objective. Here's a math example. Students will be able to measure acute and obtuse angles, and in order to do that, students will write about the similarities and differences between acute and obtuse angles. And our third example is a science example para las personas que enseñan las ciencias. The content objective, students will be able to create a model of a single cell organism. And what students will do to demonstrate that they've accessed that grade level content is that they will be able to label the parts of a single cell organism and then orally discuss the functions of each part to a partner. So at this time, what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to see how we're doing with our own webinar content and language objectives. One of the things that I remind teachers about is the fact that they can't just post the content and language objective and then not actually reference it during the lesson. And so even as part of the instruction that's taking place, always take a moment to have students read your content objective and your language objective so that they can guide you and tell you whether we're on the right path or not. So our content objective was webinar participants will be able to identify key characteristics of effective content and language objectives. If you were here with me in the session or if we were in the same space, I would ask you to give me a thumbs up or to lightly tap on your table. But since we're not, I can tell you that we've actually taken the path on meeting our content objective. So we are headed in the right direction. As far as our language objective, webinar participants will be able to, via an interactive poll activity, modify a written content and language objective. And although we haven't had that opportunity, you definitely are getting the foundation and the review so that we can get to that point. So most teachers will say, I get content objectives, Jose, but why are language objectives so hard to write? So one of the tools that I wanted to share and that here at the Center for Applied Linguistics we utilize as well as with Education Connections are these 6 ways in which any teacher can actually strengthen the language objective. So let's go through those really quickly. Number 1, as a teacher, you can determine what key vocabulary or concept words your students need to understand in order to achieve or understand what is expected of them as far as the content language. Decide which language skills are needed to accomplish the lessons activity. So that's in regards to the listening, speaking, reading, and writing. Language functions that the students will need to use during the lesson. Grammar or language structure is very important. And I know that we have some middle school and high school teachers, and having been a middle school and a high school teacher, I know that sometimes we think we're content experts, but I would like to remind you that we are also language experts for that content as far as that subject is concerned as well. Number 5, delineate which tasks students will do to accomplish the content objective. And then number 6, explore possible language learning strategies. So this will be available for you to reference back once we finalize or finish the webinar. But let's go ahead and take a look at each one of those carefully so that you can get some examples for each. So, preparando los objetivos del idioma, preparing language objectives. As far as key vocabulary and concept words, if I'm teaching a lesson and I know there are specific words that I want my students to practice as they're manipulating the listening, speaking, reading, and writing activities, then I need to make that a part of my language objective. So students will be able to use the words and phrases in all, regrouping, and 2-digit numbers when explaining how they solved a multiplication problem. And so this is very important because as a teacher I've already identified the vocabulary that they need to be able to manipulate. As far as the second example, students will be able to explain orally and in writing the following terms: executive, legislative, and judicial. Let's take a look at preparando language objectives as far as language skills are concerned. Decide which language skills are needed to accomplish the lessons activities. Give me 1 second so that I can clear my screen. Students will be able to read the story problem, annotating the cue words and phrases. And so the thing that you need to remember here is that usually when we begin working on language objectives, we focus on the listening, the speaking, the reading, and the writing. And so definitely it's one of the things that we can use to really make our language objectives more robust. But we can also add some of the other 6 methods to really strengthen that language objective. The second one is students will be able to write using a three-circle Venn diagram as far as the similarities and differences among the three types of triangles are concerned. What about language functions? So we have the first example. Students will be able to list and explain the steps to solve a story problem involving two-digit multiplication. Or perhaps at the secondary level, students will be able to argue and defend the need for fairness and rules by individuals and by people in authority. So remember that the language function is the language that the students will need to be able to produce when they are trying to access that grade level content. So compare and contrast, justify, defend, hypothesize, those are all language functions. Identify grammar and language structure. If I'm a gen ed teacher and I realize that my students are having a difficult time with past tense, then I can actually include that as part of my language objective directly connected to my content objective. So the students will be able to use the past tense to explain how they solved the multiplication problem. Or the secondary example, explain the meaning of the prefixes giga, kilo, mega, and tera when used with byte or in front of other stems such as gram or watt. Quiero parar en este momento para recordarles a las maestras y maestros que trabajan en programas duales que todos estos ejemplos se los puedo dar también en español para que tengan una oportunidad de ver cómo se puede preparar el objetivo del idioma en el contexto en el cual ustedes sirven. And then finally, tasks. Actually, it's our fifth one, tasks. Students will be able to skim and select key information and then to read and take notes using a graphic organizer in terms of the Civil War are two of the examples. And finally, the language learning strategies, which is one of the ones that is most important and that often teachers forget. Students will be able to use Spanish cognates to define some of the words they don't know, and students will be able to preview a text via illustrations, bold print, and review questions, which of course previewing a text is actually a learning strategy. So here are the 6 ways. Once again, I wanted to make sure that you had access to them, so I'll give you a moment to just look at them while I take a drink of water, por favor. I know that this is a lot of information. I want to reiterate that do not worry if for some of you this is the first time that you're working with content and language objectives. I am here to serve, and so you will be able to contact me via email, and I will be there for you as you figure out what is the best way to go ahead and implement these content and language objectives in your classroom. Bueno, la pregunta es, ¿están listos para cambiar el mundo? Are you ready to change the world? Because at the end of the day, that is truly what content and language objectives allow us to do. So here's another quote from my academic crush, Paulo Freire. Washing one's hand of the conflict between the powerful and the powerless means to side with the powerful, not to be neutral. And so for me, what this reminds me is that as a teacher, I can't just be a great teacher and continue to develop myself and go to PD and attend webinars much like the one that you're attending today. You're a great teacher. You're working to become a great teacher. Aplauso. That's fantastic. But on top of that, you also have to embrace your role as an advocate, a defender of equity and social justice, and an educator that is truly going to work to create access for every single English learner as well as every single student in your classes. And so that's the important thing here today. So I'm about to give you a task. I want to first go ahead and share with you a Common Core standard. For those of you that are friends from Texas, it's much like the TEKS in Texas. If you're in Virginia, the SOL standards. So we're just going to use a Common Core standard for practice. And it's in regards to determining a theme or central idea of a text and analyze its development over the course of the text. So this is, I chose a middle school example because that way our primary, elementary, as well as high school teachers would be able to participate. So this is a version of the Romeo and Juliet story. It's called Romeo and Juliet at Verona High. And I'm going to go ahead and offer you a content objective. And what I want you to do is I want you to modify the content objective so that you can strengthen and clarify that academic goal. And so here it is, and be ready to go ahead and write your answer in the question box. Students will understand the theme of the play, Romeo and Juliet at Verona High. Ay, pero ¿qué pasó con este, verdad? It's a little bit vague. So if you would take a moment and just practice and enter some examples of how you could make this content objective a little bit stronger, and that would be easier for the student to comprehend what it is that he or she will be studying as far as academic content is concerned. And let's see what we're seeing on the boxes. I lost my box on my screen, no problem. We can totally look at some of them. So the students will analyze the theme of the play. Students will be able to describe the theme of the play, Romeo and Juliet, to a partner. Okay, so you've taken it to the language objective there because you've identified one of the 4 language domains. Students will explain the theme of the play. Students will be able to identify the theme and or will be able to give examples from the play that illustrate the theme. Ándale, ahí vas, me gustó ese sí me gustó. Students will explain how the theme of the play developed over the course of the play. Okay, good, we're on the right path. I'm going to go ahead and give you the language objective now, and then I'll share with you a possibility, because obviously you as a teacher would be able to make this content objective your own. So let's take a look at the language objective. Students will talk about what happens in the play Romeo and Juliet at Verona High. It's not bad. I did address the talk, which is obviously speaking. But if you'll go ahead and type in, how can I make this a little bit stronger? Remember that I've given you 6 different ways that you can make ese objetivo del idioma un poquito más fuerte, ¿verdad? Para que puedas apoyar a los estudiantes, so that you can make it just a little bit more robust. So let's take a look at some of your language objectives on the screen. Students will be able to orally explain the conflict of Romeo and Juliet. Nice. Students will discuss examples from the play that illustrate the theme of the play with a partner. I like that you actually delineated that it was going to be a partner, so that could be a think, pair, share. We could offer some language frames that will give and scaffold for the students, give them a little bit more support. Students will be able to use the vocabulary of the theme and conflict in the play with a partner. So you used one of the 6 strategies that I gave you. I like that a lot as well. A ver si tengo uno en español. ¿No veo uno en español? A ver, ¿dónde están mis maestras y maestros del programa dual? Students will share key events that lead to conflict of Romeo and Juliet in their discussion group. Very nice. So there we would be, it would be a different grouping configuration, so I would be excited to see which strategy you would be using to make that happen. And then we'll do one more. Students will perform a dialogue. Oh my goodness, perform a dialogue. As a theater major, I'm all for performing a dialogue about an important scene to demonstrate understanding of the plot. Of course, role play is one of the strategies that is very effective in sheltering instruction. A través de los diálogos, ya vi español tan importante, ¿verdad? Comparar los personajes de Romeo y Julieta, ¿cómo se compararían? ¿Qué sería el idioma que tuvieran que producir los estudiantes, verdad? Los estudiantes serán capaces de discutir la trama de la obra de Romeo y Julieta para demostrar lo que entendieron de los roles. Ahí vamos, me gusta mucho. Quisiera ofrecerte tal vez una estrategia instruccional para que los estudiantes pudieran compartir en un modo más definido, ¿verdad? Thank you so much. I love that part. That was so fantastic. Me encantó. Maravilloso, ¿verdad? I'm sorry that you had to see the side of my face, but it's not my greatest angle, but we'll deal with it. One of the things that I would have probably done is I would have provided a graphic organizer. So perhaps using the graphic organizer provided, students will be able to identify the theme of the play and support with 2 pieces of text evidence. That might be a little bit of a stronger content objective. As far as the language objective, if I was teaching this class, maybe I would have the students orally justify their choices regarding the theme of the play by sharing with various classmates their 2 pieces of text evidence. I perhaps could let them use the graphic organizer and provide some language frames. And finally, I probably might use a strategy like an inside-outside circle, where the students would be able to manipulate the academic language multiple times with different partners that could conceivably have different language proficiencies, which is one of the things that we would want to do with our English learners. Maravilloso. Me encanta. Les doy las gracias. Thank you so much for participating in that activity. So let's go back to the title of our session. ¿Qué content and language objectives son importantes? And the answer, of course, is sí, sí, y sí, y sí, y sí. Of course, they're extremely important. And the reason that they're important is that you're creating access to that academic content via the listening, speaking, reading, and writing. But more importantly, you're creating access that will allow students to achieve academically, regardless of how much language they have when they enter your classroom. And that's our job and duty. So, of course, they are important. So did we meet our objectives? Webinar participants will be able to identify key characteristics of effective content and language objectives. If you were here, I think that you would be knocking on your table because we actually did do that. And the language objective, webinar participants will be able to modify a written content and language objective. And of course, that's the activity that we just did with Romeo and Juliet, the adapted Romeo and Juliet text. So I think that you would be knocking on your table as well because we actually met that objective as well. I want you to remember that content and language objectives do create that access and opportunity. I hope that you don't write your content objectives and your language objectives on the board for your administrators. I hope that if you're not doing it now, that you will write those content and language objectives on the board for your students, and that they will understand that the only way that they can access grade level content is via listening, speaking, reading, and writing. I put another picture of myself there because I want you to know that although my entry into the public school system was very traumatic, if it weren't for teachers like you, there's no reason that I would be here facilitating a PD session on content and language objectives or serving at the Center for Applied Linguistics. So thank you for all of the work that you do. Know that it is important and that there are people there that cherish what you do. And know that when you are serving English learners, you're not just creating access for them. The picture on the right-hand side is actually a picture of my family, and know that you've created access for my brother and my sister and their children and the children that haven't even been born. So muchas gracias, les agradezco mucho estar aquí que hayan estado aquí conmigo. Fue un placer estar con ustedes. It was awesome to be here with you. And at this point, we'll go ahead and have some preguntas y respuestas, some questions and answers. So if you do have some questions, go ahead to the questions box within the GoToWebinar window, and for the next 10 or 11 minutes, we'll try to answer as many as possible. Again, if we don't get to all of them, we will be able to answer them after the webinar via email. Thanks so much. Let me go ahead and mute my
Great. Well, thank you so much, Jose. That was a very informative webinar presentation, and we've gotten in some good questions. Let's try and get through as many as we can. One of the first questions that came in was, how do you address the notion that students with special needs whose native language is Spanish must learn in English? And to continue on, Jessica says, I hear this a lot in our district because they will eventually transition into an English middle school, and I am at a dual language school. This to me is very subtractive, subtractive mentality.
Okay, so I love Okay, so I love the question because obviously having been a campus principal at a dual language school and serving dual language students, it was very important for our students to receive the support that they needed in their native language. I have to agree that providing the services in a language that is not the language of instruction is not the most ideal situation. And so I think that one of the things that you would be able to do is first and foremost have a conversation with the campus leadership. There's tons of research out there that if you reach out to me via email, I can provide you with. But obviously, students in a dual language program should not be receiving educational services for their special needs in a language that is not the language of instruction. And I would like to say that I don't see that often, but actually it's something that happens quite frequently, especially in dual immersion programs. Sometimes the language of instruction is Spanish, especially in those primary grades when it is a 90-10 program. And what ends up happening is that the students are receiving services in English, which doesn't align with first of all, it doesn't align with best practice, but it also doesn't align with the goals of dual language programming. So I completely agree with you, and I'm sorry that I don't have a better answer for you other than to speak with your principal, because the truth is that the services, the research, and the instructional strategies are out there. It's about having that person that would be able to provide the special education services in the language of instruction.
Great. Very well said. Another question we have that I think some of the other participants are wondering, so would you say that for every lesson, all domains should be addressed when creating language objectives?
That's actually one of my favorite questions, Shireen. Absolutely not. Look, you're a professional, you're a certified teacher, and so I know that when I was in the classroom, and even as a principal, teachers would vouch for me, but I actually would teach lessons even as a principal just so that I could be in the mix and continue to hone my craft. I would only focus on the appropriate language domain. And so especially if it's a lesson that's going to be, that's going to take several days, you can definitely just focus on one of the 4 language domains, knowing that you're going to hit the others throughout the spread over the length of that lesson, the duration of that lesson. I will caution that the one that usually gets forgotten is the listening. And so I would always remind teachers, I will always remind teachers to not forget the listening when also targeting speaking. Activities like the one that I mentioned, the inside-outside circle, or the reel, which are strategies that are used to create authentic student interaction, actually allow the teacher to explicitly have students listen, practice their listening as others are speaking. So to answer your question once again, no, you can target specific language domains, but never forget the listening, because that's the one we tend to forget.
Great. And kind of on that about your own experiences with language and content objectives, what challenges have you faced as an educator when you identify content and language objectives in your own classroom?
One of the things that will definitely make your job as a teacher much easier when working with content and language objectives is understanding that you're always going to do the best that you can, but that sometimes you're going to mess up. I think that often we're so scared to try and make mistakes that we just don't even venture there. So as you're implementing and posting content and language objectives, just be sure to be kind to yourself, as you will make mistakes. Working in a grade level team or a professional learning community where you can actually brainstorm with one another and have other peers take a look at your content and specifically your language objectives, because those tend to be the most difficult ones, as we've already mentioned, really makes the task much easier. At the end of the day, look, having been a principal, I don't know of any campus principal that will go into a classroom and if there's great learning taking place, that they're going to be angry if somehow you didn't fully flesh out the language objective to the degree that they wanted. So it's about the process and continuing to grow in that direction.
Great. And another question that I thought might be of interest to our population tonight is, with the recent controversy surrounding newcomers, especially refugees. What are your thoughts regarding instructing newcomers to sheltered instruction classrooms upon arrival to the United States?
So I think that the first thing that I would stress is that cultural proficiency training is something that is extremely important and needed in every campus and school district. And that goes along with the rest of the question, because I think that 99.9% of us as educators are good people, and that's not a research. I'm just estimating that 99.9% of us are good people. But often when we're subtractive or say discriminatory things against some of our students who are newcomers, refugees, or English learners, it doesn't come from a place of malice. But I can tell you that I have heard teachers say, I just have a new student that matriculated and is in my classroom, and it's their, their first time in a U.S. school, and Jose, they don't know anything. And so I breathe in and breathe out, right, because I'm a professional, and then I pose the question, well, what do they bring to the classroom? Because they do bring something to the classroom. Perhaps it's not, it doesn't sound like, it doesn't look like, and it doesn't feel like what you're used to, but that student brings some kind of experience into the classroom. And so it is our job, whether or not they have any English at all, to make that grade level content accessible via listening, speaking, reading, and writing. And I can give you a specific example. I was providing service to a school district this past week, and I led an activity with them. It was a Chinese Mandarin shock lesson, and I showed them a video where they are being instructed in the grade level academic content in Chinese. And in the first clip, the teachers that were participating were very frustrated because, of course, none of them in the room spoke Chinese. But in the second clip, the teacher actually uses a lot of strategies to make the grade level content accessible via content objective and specific activities that target the 4 language domains. And interestingly enough, every single one of the participating teachers were able to grasp the academic content and even learn several words in Chinese, despite the fact that in essence they were all newcomers to that lesson. So it can be done. It is not easy, but at the end of the day, that's our job, to make that grade level content accessible via the language objective.
So I think we only have time for one more question, and I just wanted to know if you think that teachers need to write different language objectives within a lesson for students of different proficiency levels.
Great question. Absolutely not. The language objective, as well as the content objective, is posted for every single student. The way in which we differentiate and provide scaffolding would be done through the activities or the lesson preparation that we prepare ahead of time to support those needs. But remember that your content and language objectives don't just create access for your English learners. Most of us have academic language learners in our classrooms. We have students that come from different socioeconomic backgrounds, students that perhaps don't have the same schema that some of the other students in our classes have. And so the content and the language objective has to be the same for all of your students. However, you can provide a variety of supports based on the proficiency levels.
Great. Well, we'd like to thank Dr. Medina for sharing his expertise with us today, and each of you for taking the time to participate in today's webinar. We hope it's been helpful to you as part of your teaching practice. We'd also like to extend one final invitation to continue to connect and collaborate with us and your fellow educators on Education Connections. And don't forget, today's live event webinar, as well as a copy of the PowerPoint, will be available with any other resources Dr. Medina suggests on Education Connections. Feel free to reach out to the team at edconnect@cal.org with any questions you may have about the webinar or the community. Thank you again, and we hope you have a wonderful holiday season and a very happy new year.
Gracias por su participación. Thank you so much. And if you do need anything, please feel free to contact me at jmedina@cal.org. For those of you that do know me, I saw some familiar names. You know that my motto in education is lo que se dice se hace, that which you say you do. And so if you send me an email, I can assure you that within 72 hours from whatever hotel room I'm in, you will receive an answer. So thank you so much. Gracias de nuevo y nos vemos pronto. Adiós.